On the first part of just covering the basics, and I'm going to be asking each of you, and you might all have the same answer, but just to start off with, how would you define what we're calling holistic client-centered approach to legal services? And so, actually, since we started with Reedy, I'll start with Josh now.
Sure. So I think of holistic client-centered services in a couple different ways. I think there's certainly, obviously, the idea of holistically addressing their legal issues. That is, that acknowledging that any client is facing a multitude of legal issues, it's attempting to address all of them. It's a lofty goal, but that's the idea of at least addressing their many different legal issues. But I think it also has a strong component of representing your client as a whole person. I think it's, especially in small firms or in civil legal aid where there's not enough time, there's not enough resources, that we can be awfully rushed trying to help as many people as we can, but there's so many instances where providing representation that really acknowledges that client as a whole person is such an important component, not just in the dignity of your client, but in providing good legal services for them. The last component I wanted to mention is also taking the holistic approach to your organization as a whole. We're each trying to do this work with individual clients, but it also comes with the acknowledgement that every one of our organizations needs to improve from within to be able to provide better services for our clients.
Great, thank you. Catherine, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think holistic legal services are really meeting clients where they are and sort of breaking down some of the barriers between client and lawyer so that you can really have an authentic relationship and better understand all of the myriad issues that people are facing. In Diana's example, there were a lot of issues going on for that individual, and it was only when they got this notice of, very formal notice of foreclosure that they reached out for assistance. And that's something that I find a lot, that, people have a lot of issues in their lives, and they may not recognize that that one, they are legal issues, and two, that there might be assistance out there to help them. And so when people come in the door, because they've received a notice or because they finally triggered that this is a legal issue, I think it's important to then really understand their full picture, their full situation in order to be able to work with them to address some of those issues. And in some ways, holistic client services can seem like I am this family's permanent attorney. They just know to call me. And in some ways I love that because it's like, well, yeah, I really do want to know what's going on and to make sure that they're still stable. But sometimes that gets down into the nitty-gritty, like, well, the towel holder fell off the bathroom wall and the landlord won't fix it. It's like, well, I'm not going to intervene on that particular issue, but, thanks for thinking of me and recognizing that this is an issue. So I guess that's
great. Thank you. Reedy?
I think both of you already touched on it, but basically recognizing that one size does not fit all. I think Josh put it really well. Accepting the person and not just the case is sort of central to what holistic services mean. To be client-centered, I also think there's sort of an inherent requirement that as practitioners, we also be flexible, recognizing that a client's goals and objectives and the sort of outcomes and expectations that they have related to the legal process can be changing based on what their needs are and what's happening in that moment in their life. I also think for holistic, there needs to be an understanding of sort of the social impact, the psychological impact, physical, emotional impacts that this has on the client, and sort of thinking about the larger context and, how the client is situated and how this case is affecting so many other aspects of the client's life.
Great, thank you. So to follow up that question, there might be some overlap, but I'm wondering, especially thinking as a person that, doesn't think they're using a holistic model and they think, okay, this sounds good, I want to give this a try and roll up my sleeves. What are some things that they should keep in mind in terms of what are markers that would make one's approach? Like they even to right now jot down like, okay, I'm going to make myself a to-do list of 5 different things that I want to start incorporating into my practice. What would be those markers that someone could look to that they know that they're headed in the right direction? So I'll start with Catherine.
So one of the things that we use a lot and we ask our medical providers to use is a screening tool, so to kind of run through the types of issues that clients might face. And I included the screening tool in the materials. So that's one way to think about making sure that you're considering the holistic issues that a client faces. And I think other options are to understand that you don't have to be an expert at every subject area or to know every resource, but to really think about the resources that you are aware of, and so particularly with the medical legal partnership, to think about medical providers in your community that you might be able to partner with or even just to meet with to understand the kinds of issues that their patients are facing, where the medical provider is feeling frustrated that there's not a solution. And so it's kind of the classic example for this is kids who have asthma who come into the clinic, their parents are doing everything right, they're filling their prescriptions, they're following their doctor's advice, but yet the child returns to their home environment and ends up back in the emergency room, a couple weeks later. And, of course, it comes to find out that the house has mold. And so it doesn't matter what the doctor is going to be able to do in the clinic. You really need to be able to reach out and deal with the home environment. So just thinking through, talking to medical providers about those kinds of issues. And it may take a while for medical providers to recognize and reveal like, oh, yeah, that is, a problem that I see all the time. Sometimes it feels like it's just insurmountable. I don't know what to do about that. I don't do home visits. I don't know anything about mold. So really thinking about, kind of the pain points for medical providers. And even if you're a solo practitioner, you could do that and reach out, have lunch with a medical provider to understand some of the barriers that they're seeing to good patient health, and then seeing if that fits into a part of your practice where you could receive referrals from that medical provider. So I suppose in some sort of a screening tool, and then reaching out and talking to other disciplines, and particularly in the work that I do, medical providers, to understand the issues that they're seeing and see if there's any overlap there that you can work on.
Thank you. Reedy, what about you?
I liked how Catherine brought up not having to be an expert in every aspect of a client's case. I think to be holistic, a really basic sort of marker of that would be being willing to acknowledge that the client is experiencing multiple issues and not every issue needs to be legal. I have not been in private practice, but our program did have serious funding cuts a few years ago, and I was essentially in a solo practice position where we were running the program just with one attorney. And I recognize that time it's really hard to balance clients' needs with the sort of limited time that we have, but kind of readjusting how we do intakes and how we interact with clients and kind of allowing a client to be able to share the experience that they're having in that moment is one way of kind of approaching the holistic model. I do think another sort of marker of being holistic is trying to actively have some humility and recognize that as attorneys, we don't always have the answer, and the legal system is not always the answer. Catherine talked about medical legal partnerships. Our program, for example, we work very collaboratively with domestic violence programs, counseling programs, therapy programs, to be able to connect clients to other resources. So even kind of thinking about what other resources exist in your community that you can direct a client to, I think is a kind of a first step in trying to engage in the holistic model.
Right.
I would definitely echo the recognition of the limitations of anyone in practice, that we can't know how to do everything. So recognizing that is really important. I think also an aspect of client-centered representation is essentially mindfulness. It's really knowing, and I think we've touched on that in different ways. It takes a humility of knowing that you can't solve everything, that not everything is a legal problem. It's a recognition of, who am I walking into this situation? A white man in a suit who has been to law school and knows much more about what's going on in this situation than my client might. So understanding that when I'm talking with my client. And I think it also takes within an organization, within a practice, even if you're a solo practitioner, it takes an intentionality to constantly be growing and constantly be learning. And not just in, if you do Social Security disability law, that you dedicate yourself to finding out how to perfect unemployment representation. I think it's good to be continually exposed to new areas of practice, but I think it's also important to be engaged in learning what's going on in our community altogether. We can become very siloed in the different areas of practice that we're in, but we already have, and I'm sure we'll continue mentioning the importance of being able to have community resources and refer to others. And if you're not constantly learning and being engaged with your community with intention, then you're not going to know what resources are out there. And I say intention because it's not just going to happen. You really have to intend to put this model in place. And I really like this I help model because it's an opportunity to put it right there in the face of the doctors who are interacting with folks and really put it out there that they can immediately look at what are the issues, have a quick consultation of what's going on, and really have a starting point to move on in addressing all of your clients' legal problems. So those are the few things I'd say are some markers for sure. Great,
thank you. It's very helpful. So the next question, which maybe we should have started with this question first, is starting with the why. And through our conversation, we're talking about, this takes more effort, you have limited time. I think we could maybe think about all the reasons why not to. But what are all the reasons to use this approach? And I'll start with Reedy.
I think this pendulum is essentially swinging back. As lawyers, we are in this powerful position to sort of set the narrative about our own reputation as a profession. And lawyers actually used to be from the community, and that was where people would go when they had issues and they had questions about what to do. And the sort of community lawyer model over time has disappeared as the practice has grown, areas have grown, people have specialized. But I think that through that process, as a profession, we've also sort of lost our connection to our communities. And you see it through lawyer jokes. You see kind of based on the portrayals that we see in the media about how attorneys are kind of portrayed in stories. And so it kind of makes sense to revisit this approach. This was an approach that existed before, and we're not suggesting anything new. I think we're kind of revisiting what it means to be a practitioner. And if we want to serve our communities better, if we want to be a part of our communities and be better connected, I think it makes sense to take this approach and try to be more holistic in how we work with the communities and clients we serve.
Yeah, I would agree. I think just the entire mission of civil legal aid work is not to create a revolving door of our clients, solving one issue and coming back with the next. I think, like Catherine said, that oftentimes we can form this really strong relationship with the client, and they can come back with many different issues. But I think starting with the holistic model gives the opportunity to try and address all the problems, at least identify them when you have the opportunity to take action. It essentially provides more effective representation because being in civil legal aid work, there's more work than there is time to do. There's more work than there are attorneys to do it. So this creates the opportunity to help one person and then be able to help the next person. It really makes your advocacy a lot more effective. I think it's also important for the dignity of our clients that by the nature of low-income clients, that many of them are so used to being churned through bureaucracies, through waiting rooms, through lines, and not getting answers. And this is really the opportunity to bring them some dignity, to recognize them as a whole person, that their lives are complicated, that that's okay, and to try and address all those issues together. So I think it's really important for their dignity as well as for us. I feel much better having a greater connection with my client, seeing them for all of the complexity of their life. It makes my practice a lot more fulfilling because I have a stronger connection to them as well.
Thanks. Catherine?
I certainly think that this is providing services holistically and using community resources and again, within the medical legal partnership, relying on social workers and medical providers to assist you in representing clients and patients. It's just so much more efficient and effective. I had done foreclosure defense before joining the medical legal partnership, and I remember just feeling, anybody that's dealt with a loan servicer in a bank knows that, it's like you're beating your head against the wall trying to talk to someone who's reasonable. And I just remember that feeling of being like very alone in trying to do this work and save people's houses. And this is like the exact opposite. I feel like I'm working in community with social workers and nurses and medical providers and going into community sites where clients feel more comfortable. They take their kids to appointments there. They get a lot of services out of those medical provider sites. And so it's a much more comfortable environment for them than to coming to my downtown office with very expensive parking. So I think it's more effective. I think it's more efficient, and it's a gentler, sort of kinder way of providing services to clients because you're really meeting them in places where they already go. And I think you get better results, absolutely, without question.
Right. Okay. I was just, as you're talking about the why, I was actually thinking about different experiences I have had going to the doctor. Unfortunately, most of my doctor experience are them, rushing me through with whatever one issue I come up with, and they're clicking away at the computer, not really looking at me. But every once in a while, I have a medical provider who looks at me and says, like, what else is going on? And I'm just like, what? And, I leave feeling so much better, not just because they gave me, whatever the prescription is for my cold, but, talking about some other things that maybe started the reason why I had the cold. So I think it's just walking away, that your client walking away feeling like they actually got some help. Okay, so the next question is really, in my mind, is, sometimes it's helpful as we're learning about things to have a picture of what it actually looks like. So if you wouldn't mind just sharing maybe a client story or an example, and Josh shared a little earlier like what a typical day looks like, which was eye-opening for me. But if you could imagine you're meeting with a client for the first time, you're about to enter into some sort of client-attorney relationship, what will that look like to use a holistic model in helping that client? Josh.
Well, one client story immediately came to mind, both because the legal issues he was facing were complex, and he as a person is very complex and needed some special attention. So I think the holistic model addressed both of those in his case. So my client was, by being assigned to a public defender, had been charged with a crime. He was referred to me because his Social Security benefits had been cut off. His Social Security benefits had been cut off because he had not completed the naturalization process. And on top of all of that, at the moment, he was involuntarily committed. So those were all of his legal issues happening at once. On top of that, what I knew about him as a person before I got to meet with him is that he was a refugee from Burundi. So knowing that I was going to be helping him with immigration paperwork, I wanted to find out a little bit more about what had happened in Burundi that caused him to be here. So I knew a little bit about the Rwandan genocide, and so I really just took some time to research what happened in Burundi. That way I have a better understanding when I go in to talk to this person. And it made a big difference in our whole interaction. It made me not just somebody who's there to help him complete paperwork, but it created a much better understanding for us. And I think it played out very practically in a lot of ways. Anyone who's gone through immigration paperwork, particularly the N-400, it asks so many questions that seem extremely antiquated, like, were you a part of the Nazis?
Yeah.
Exactly. And so knowing the sort of questions they ask and having the opportunity to have some background about what had happened in Burundi, I was much better able to understand when it comes to questions like, have you threatened violence against someone? Have you participated in guerrilla warfare? Things like that it asks about on these forms. And I could come into this situation understanding he's a refugee who fled a very real situation like this, and because he's involuntarily committed, I know he's at a particularly vulnerable place. So it was an opportunity to really prepare himself for the potential triggers that might come up. Because he didn't speak English, we were also working with an interpreter for a language that's not very common. So we had the choice of either an interpreter in his language on the phone or an interpreter in a similar dialect in person. All of those considerations, the considerations of what does it mean working with an interpreter. It was all a situation that went much more smoothly because I was able to do a little bit of background. I asked the right questions that were able to help me understand my client and have a much better experience. And I think a lot of it, like I said before, takes just the intention and the willingness to ask questions. One of the other things that I knew about my client, and I think really speaks to the importance of bringing dignity to our clients with holistic representation, is that I knew my client had also lost his hands before he came to the United States. So I simply asked somebody who had worked with him, does he have a method for signing? Because if he doesn't, I don't want to hand him a pen and make him feel like he's in an awkward place where he's not able to sign. His social worker explained to me how he signs forms. I was able to facilitate that, and it was able to be a much more genuine process. And I think I know he felt a much better outcome coming out of it, rather than just simply getting his forms completed.
Thank you. Thank you, Josh. Catherine, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, we have lots of examples, but one that's sort of brief, I think, is we host a legal transitions clinic at Seattle Children's Hospital for child patients who are turning 18 or approaching turning 18, to talk with parents and the child patients about whether or not a guardianship is necessary, or if the patient has sufficient capacity to sign a power of attorney document, or sort of planning toward transitioning into adulthood. And that means that the social worker has identified that there's a patient that's going to be turning 18, and they make a referral to us, and obviously the parents are aware and involved and consent to it, but a lot of times they come to the hospital and they're really not sure what they're there to do. And so this was a family who spoke Marshallese, and although we had scheduled an interpreter to be there in person, because of this, there's just not enough interpreters for the Marshallese language. Oftentimes, Marshallese interpreters are triaging within the tasks that they're asked to do, and so if they have to go to some more pressing matter, then we end up without an interpreter. So we had to get an interpreter by phone, which is not ideal. And so it was a mother and her child who was approaching 18. And we were meeting with them and really kind of talking through the options and the issues, and really felt like we'd reached a point where we understood the next steps and what we were going to do. And the mother, sort of just casually lifted this notice out of her purse to say, oh, and I also got this in the mail. And it was in English. She did not understand what it was about, but it was cutting off her TANF. And so that was the family's sole income. The reason why their TANF was being terminated was because the mother had, failed to participate in whatever the required activities that she was to do in order to maintain the TANF. And of course, the reason why she wasn't able to do that is because she was providing full-time care to her daughter. And without the TANF, they would lose their subsidized housing. And so, what came in as a very casual, like, we've got lots of time to think about this and we'll meet with you again, became a very emergent situation. But for the social worker referring this family to us, I don't know what they would have done. Their TANF would have been cut off. They wouldn't have been able to pay the rent. And so we would have gotten them, while the crisis was happening instead of beforehand. So we were able to intervene and negotiate with DSHS and get the TANF turned back on, and then talk to the landlord about what had happened, as well as making a plan to get the rent, paid up once the TANF came back in. So it was, it worked out incredibly well. It's always better to get clients at the front end of a legal issue rather than when they're, at the deadline facing an eviction. So this was just, a really nice, succinct example. And there, are lots of them because, again, people show up to take their kids to the doctor, and once they know that there's more help available to them there, then they're more willing to share about the other issues that they're facing, and so we can work with them on those as well.
Thank you. Reedy?
Very similar kinds of cases. What the example I was thinking of, I had a client where she had been sexually assaulted by a coworker, and when she had reported to her employer, they solely essentially cut her hours and then said that she wasn't doing her work properly, and then they terminated her. So I got the referral based on the employment issue, but as I began working with her, I realized there were multiple other issues. So she had applied for unemployment, and her unemployment had been denied based on the report that her employer had provided as to the reason why she had been terminated. She also needed a protection order because her rapist was connected to her social community and was still very much present in her life, even though she was no longer working at the place that they had initially met at. The other concern was she had wanted to report to police about the rape, but her rapist had a family member working within law enforcement, and so her big fear was safety and how does she report safely and not have further consequences related to reporting her rapist. And through this process, without having unemployment and without having a paycheck coming in, she ended up not being able to pay her rent and had the eviction process started against her. And also she had her previous criminal charge that had turned into a deferred prosecution, and because she had fallen behind on the requirements for the deferred prosecution, it was in the middle of converting to a conviction. That would have affected further future employment if there was going to be a permanent conviction against her. And so long story short, most of the issues we were able to resolve, and that is a part of the holistic model, which is that there's no guarantee that we can always achieve the outcome that we would want for our clients, especially when you're dealing with multiple issues. It's often like a jigsaw puzzle that you're trying to figure out which one do I work on first to be able to really make sure that the rest of the issues can be resolved more efficiently. But through working with the client, I also, for example, I realized that she had some resources in the community because she was a member of one of the local tribes, and getting her reconnected to the tribe and getting her connected to resources, even though it's not technically legal representation, it was something that I recognized. Josh has used the language of dignity. Like, it was important for my client's dignity, for her well-being, that she be reconnected to a community that was going to support her. So it's always a little bit of a roller coaster that you get on with your clients once you take on the holistic model. But I think once you also kind of start paying attention to how the issues can connect and can actually get further aggravated if you're not trying to address them at the beginning, it's just really helpful to kind of be thinking about that full picture. And this is just one example, but I think all of us could be pulling multiple examples of cases like this.
Yes. Okay, we're going to move to the next section, which is going a little deeper and trying to get into the nitty-gritty of what it means to use this model. And hearing your stories, I was feeling overwhelmed, obviously for the client, but just for the person who is sitting in front of the client hoping to help this person. And so my next question is, as an attorney or an advocate, that you're meeting with this, person after person with these really overwhelming stories, are there certain tools or resources that you find yourself going back to? And maybe you don't even think of it as a tool anymore because it's just in your brain now. But is there a way that you think through all of these different issues? Because I think as a person that I haven't recently been practicing, I'm like, where do I even begin? So I know, Catherine, you had mentioned a tool that the medical providers that you're working with, they use that, but are there tools that you and your colleagues on the legal side might use as you're approaching, whether it's just sort of sorting through all the different issues, and then specifically, how do you identify, obviously legal, but if there are non-legal issues as well that you might want to refer that person to getting addressed?
Yes. Well, so the Northwest Justice Project maintains a self-help legal website, Washington Law Help, and so there's a lot of materials that we can point patients and medical providers to sort of read through and try and address their legal issues maybe on their own at first. As far as tools that the advocates use, I think a lot of it is just inside our heads. I mean, the Washington Medical Legal Partnership, the National Medical Legal Partnership site does have lots and lots of tools for people to look at and use, and they're all just available for download. So I would say checking those out. And I suppose the other thing is that we've developed a lot of templates, so they're, people have very similar legal issues over and over again: landlord-tenant, reasonable accommodation, Social Security issues, TANF terminations. And so we've tried to maintain sort of templates of how to address those issues, so that then if we have a law student, that we're able to have the law student, we've already sort of front-loaded kind of the work, and they can work on that, as well as medical providers and some of our higher functioning clients are able to just sort of pick those tools up and run with them. I think that's it.
Great, thanks. Reedy, what about you? Are there any tools that you and your colleagues might use?
Just sort of the nature of the kind of cases that we get, which is sexual assault. One, really basic tool that is a non-legal tool is talking to the client about if they're connected to other community programs, such as like case managers or therapists and counselors. I think once you have this sort of team approach with clients, and you're able to get clients connected to other resources, it can in some ways take the pressure off of you to feel like you have to be able to know, you have to have the answer to everything that they're coming to you with. Because I am not a mental health expert. I may not know as many resources in the community. I'm always amazed by the case managers I work with, how they know who to call and where to go and what time to show up at places to get things done for their clients. So I think really thinking about community resources as a tool, as a first step, not even like, waiting for a while working with the client, but really kind of at the very front end, thinking about how to get them connected to other resources. Another really basic tool for us is trying to get as much information through the referral process. I really like Josh's example of talking to the social worker beforehand about like, how do I approach this client who may have issues with being able to sign the paperwork. This is a part of us trying to be more trauma informed, which is, the clients are not approaching attorneys because, things are good in their life. They're usually approaching us because there is a crisis. And before they've talked to me, I try to be thoughtful of the fact that they've probably had to talk to quite a few people about what they're experiencing. And they're probably pretty exhausted, and they're probably assuming that I'm not going to be listening, or I might be responding the exact same way other people have responded previously. And so I try to do my research and essentially gather some information ahead of time if I can, through the referral process, or if somebody else has contacted me about this case. So by the time the client is coming to me, we're no longer at step one, we're already kind of at step two. That's also assuming that the client is ready to kind of start talking about next steps to take. Sometimes it does take a little while to build some trust and build a relationship, and as a part of that, I may need to start again from step one and really gather more information or initial information from the beginning, but trying to do some information gathering beforehand so that the client isn't having to repeat everything again. I also think as attorneys, a lot of times we're kind of thinking about client credibility, and I really want to check to see if they're saying the same thing. But when I think as a part of the holistic model, it's better to approach your client with the default that they are credible. And if you just are starting out assuming all your clients are liars, I don't know, maybe the legal profession is not where you should be. And then lastly, just something really basic that we learn in law school and sometimes we forget, asking really open-ended questions. Instead of having a big checklist or like really trying to figure out the timeline or chronology or the facts of a case, just starting out with open-ended questions about, what's important to you, what's brought you here, how do you think I can help you? I think that can often be a really basic starting point and sort of a tool that we forget about the longer we practice.
Thanks. Josh?
I think there's a variety of different things. I think one area that Rita really touched on is where we get the information that basically is just there in our head that we've almost forgotten about. So I wanted to call out a couple of things that I think are really helpful. One is if you ever have the opportunity to participate in a poverty simulation. I've done it once or twice, and I think it's incredibly enlightening, simply because you're put through the rigors of being in poverty. You're usually assigned sort of a fake profile that involves a criminal charge. You're trying to take care of probation and get food stamps and get a job. And for a few hours, you're put through the ringer of all the pressures that so many of our clients are going through. So I think if you ever have the opportunity to do that, or get the resources so that you can help put one on yourself, I think is incredibly important. And part of that is also really intentionally training on these matters. Being at the Department of Public Defense, we have a very comprehensive training program. Not everybody is going to have that opportunity, but there are so many free CLEs, particularly through WSBA, that gives the opportunity to continue expanding your education, and issues like this that are not particularly about a practice area, but about how you do your practice. And then I think as far as within the organization, I think intake forms or whatever screening process is obviously really important. It's catching clients when you first encounter them. In public defense, the model is kind of different because our clients are assigned to us. So there's a very particular reason they've come to us that we already know. And I think there's also, going back to keeping your connections and knowledge is also being a part of listservs, whether that's through a particular practice area, the Access to Justice Board. So many of these organizations all have listservs that are going out there, and you can just be a part of. And there are some that are very based on, I have a problem, I email it out to the group, and I get a response back, which can be very practically helpful. And otherwise, it's just an opportunity to stay in touch with what's going on in the field. And then a couple things I wanted to call out that's really good for helping clients. Washington Law Help that Catherine already called out. I'm probably on that website more often than not because it has so many resources. It's got forms as well as instructions for completing the forms. So I think it's an incredibly valuable thing for, so that I don't have to reinvent the wheel to create a pleading or a form that's already been made out there. And then also the Washington Reentry Guide that's being developed by Washington Appleseed, and I actually just found out right before coming here that they're releasing it or making it live today. So that's very exciting. It's at wareentryguide.com, and it's an extremely comprehensive guide dealing with all kinds of issues. It's particularly geared toward individuals who are coming from incarceration and reentering the community, but I think it's about 250 pages or so of the actual physical version of resources and guidance and answering all sorts of questions. So I have no doubt that it would be of use to many different people.
Great. Well, that's actually a perfect segue to my next question. Earlier, you had mentioned, we can't be the expert of everything. And so needing to rely on relationships that you've built with others, whether from other disciplines or from other attorneys practicing in different areas. And so I wondered if you could share a little bit about what you've done to build relationships with potential referral sources. So in addition to the referral sources you could find online, like Washington Law Help, what have you done to build those relationships, to what they call make a warm handoff, or, to be able to talk to a colleague and say, my client's dealing with this issue. Is this something that I should be referring to you? So let's start with, now I forgot where we left off.
I can start.
Okay, thank you.
So for our program, I think one way we've built relationships is, I think this is very basic to all of us, which is trying to represent the client the best that we can, because our clients are experiencing multiple issues and they're going to providers and they're going to talk about their experience with their attorney. And so I think just really basic, attorney 101, treat your clients with respect and dignity, is one way of building relationships with other providers and referrals. We also do provide technical assistance. As I said earlier, we have a legal line that any attorney or advocate can contact us with questions, along with survivors. And we take those questions very seriously because we recognize that if somebody's contacting us, that means that they're trying to provide a crucial service to someone, and we want to be able to support them in that process. And through that process, I think we've been able to build relationships with other community programs and community members, and also private attorneys who we can now reach out to. Our background, we are not experts in employment law, even though we are able to work with clients in those cases, but there are attorneys that I can reach out to and ask questions of, because there's been a sort of give and take in our relationship when they've reached out to me related to their clients. I also think actually volunteering in the community and really kind of recognizing what are some of the areas that we can be involved in supporting our communities has been really helpful in building relationships. Each of our attorneys are involved in different bar associations and in different community organizations. And that itself builds relationships that allow for us to have a more comprehensive model that we can then get our clients connected to.
Okay, thanks, Reedy. What about you, Josh?
I think listservs that I mentioned before, I think is a great way to stay in touch with what other organizations are doing. In-person CLEs, this is obviously a really great format, but in-person CLEs is bringing people together around addressing some legal issue, and everybody's there with the same intention. But I think like volunteering, just going to any of the community events. I know virtually every one of the community legal service organizations in Seattle has some kind of benefit or gala or happy hour or something like that. And going to those is an opportunity to engage with the people that are doing similar work. And it is this opportunity to have what you said, a warm referral. I think we use some similar term like that, but where it's, I could tell my client to call 211, or honestly, I could text my colleague and ask them, say, hey, I've got a family law question, do you have a minute? And I wouldn't have that if I wasn't out there, engaging with the community. I think serving on bar associations, our legal community is so active. There's so many ways to get involved. And if you go out there and find your opportunity with like-minded folks, with opportunities that are going to be meaningful for your clients, I think there's just so many opportunities to build relationships and get engaged. And I know from law students to lawyers, networking is not many people's favorite thing to do, but I think doing it with this community, with this intention that it's really is not because I want to go get a beer after work. It's because I'm trying to create better relationships to serve my clients. It really is something that can be really meaningful.
Yeah, thank you. Catherine, do you have anything to add?
Just briefly, one of the things that I mentioned again with thinking about a medical legal partnership is that we do a lot of consultation. So medical providers can reach out to us and say, hey, I'm not thinking about a specific patient, but I seem to be seeing this kind of issue a lot. What do you think about this? Sort of these general questions. And then we also provide a lot of trainings to medical providers so that they can more readily identify the types of legal issues that we may be able to work on for their patients. So those are two things that are really built into the medical legal partnership model.
Great, thanks. So I'm guessing that using a holistic model hasn't just been easy and no challenges at all. So I'm wondering if you could share challenges that do seem to commonly arise when using this approach and some ways that you've used to try and overcome those challenges. I'll start with you, Josh.
I think a lot of them are issues we've talked about. Time, obviously. We've got finite amount of time. We've got finite capacity. And the recognition of our limited expertise that we've all discussed, and I think one of the challenges is just we go into this work because we want to do justice. There's so much intention of doing good that it can be overwhelming, and I think that recognizing that not everything has legal recourse. I personally cannot solve every single problem, but being willing to step up and do what you can, but recognize you can't do everything. I think a lot of it's the humility of recognizing that. I think all of those are significant challenges for attorneys to take on sometimes.
Yes. What about you, Catherine?
Other than it is time-consuming, I really can only say positive things about it. I really think it is the better way to represent individuals and, try and achieve some stability in their lives and achieve the goals that they're looking for. So I think it's time consuming. I guess I would say you need to be a little bit fearless. And just be a little bit willing to jump in and try and figure things out as you go along. But I really only have positive things to say about this model.
Great. Reedy, do you have anything to add?
Just that, like, initially it can be very intimidating when you do try to sort of engage in this model because over time, like Catherine talked about, over time you can build templates and build resources. And Josh obviously touched on, like, community connections that you can have. So it can be intimidating in the beginning, but if you do kind of follow through, I think you can figure out what is the most efficient way for you to be able to provide holistic services that are within your capacity. I mean, an example I'll use is when I first started, I wasn't paying attention to credit consumer issues. To me, that was not a legal issue. But over the last couple of years now, I've realized that is a legal issue, and so it's changed my practices, changed how I do my intakes and have my conversations with my clients about their needs. And so be kind of recognizing that you will not know all the answers or be able to issue spot necessarily everything. But as you kind of engage in the model, it will evolve.
Okay, thanks. So earlier I had mentioned in the beginning, I was referencing the state plan that had the 5 goals, and one of the goals of the state plan is around race equity. So thinking about how we are delivering legal services to our communities, but using a race equity lens. And so I'm wondering if in your practice of using a holistic model, if you've thought about that, if you've applied a race equity lens and what that looks like for you. So I'll start with you, Catherine.
I really like Columbia Legal Services developed a sort of race equity model of sort of thinking through legal issues, which really relies on the community, identifying the issues that they're facing, and then thinking about the strategies that a lawyer could work on those issues. And so I really like the idea of the community coming forward with issues that they're facing, and then the lawyer trying to see, can I work with this community to, address this issue. One of the places where we see certainly a race-based issue is in school discipline. So a lot of the children that we work with, or parents with children, have disabilities. And then on top of that, if they are a child of color, the school discipline aspect can be huge and very disparate. And so really trying to think through those issues and working with individual schools and individual principals to identify those issues is one of the ways that that I think we've used a race-based model. And then just generally thinking of people in poverty, there are higher percentages of people of color. Thinking about people who are on Medicaid, certainly higher percentages of people of color. And so thinking about those pieces in your advocacy when you're maybe raising affirmative claims, is there a race-based issue there? I think.
Great, thank you. Reedy?
In our program, we try to prioritize cases based on vulnerability. So the goal is not to turn any survivor away. So even if I cannot represent you in your case, I might be able to meet with you and do a consultation or sort of a limited legal services sort of advice, or maybe it will just be a hotline call where we talk through the case and I let you know what sort of resources exist and what are potential next steps that you might be able to engage in. And the reason for that tiered level is because we want to focus on the most vulnerable. So, for example, we would prioritize probably a case where somebody identifies as a person of color or has a disability or has maybe extensive criminal history or is homeless, and represent them in their case Whereas, somebody who maybe has access to more resources and community connections, that would be treated as a consultation or a hotline. So that's one way we do engage in sort of the race equity sort of goals in our project. The other thing is sort of recognizing that because we are in a legal system, and courts and the legal system can be a very hostile place for communities of color. We see this with young women of color we represent. They're overly sexualized in the court process and often are blamed for their own victimization. So those are cases that we definitely prioritize for representation. And sometimes it requires us sort of shuffling our cases and court dates to try to really accommodate the client. And it's not always the easiest, but it is very high priority. I mean, the other thing is, for us, it's also about our staff. Like, our staff needs to be reflective of the clients that we represent. And so over half of our staff are identified as people of color. And if we're going to say that we're going to do legal aid work, then we also not only need to focus on representation, but we also need to focus on our own hiring process. And so that's another way we've been trying to engage with the race equity state goal.
Thanks. Josh?
I was really mostly thinking about ways that we are within our organization really looking at doing our work with the race equity lens. Working in public defense, we're intimately engaged with the criminal justice system and all the things that are in the headlines of the overcriminalization of black and brown men. I see it all day, every day. Our office, people talk about racism and systemic racism passing in the hallway. It's just part of the culture of where we are. But I think going from that is not enough. I think it really takes the intention of looking at our organization, because in our department, as in the whole legal field, certainly in civil legal services, we are a predominantly white field serving a predominantly community of color. So I think it takes a lot of acknowledgement that we cannot, as an organization, just pat ourselves on the back for doing public defense work. We bring in speakers. We intentionally are constantly engaged in discussions about racism, about the way that not just criminal justice is racist, but how is our organization creating inequitable policies, and how is that affecting our staff? So I think from an institutional standpoint, it really takes a determination to keep on that, and a real humility to recognize that just because you're doing good work doesn't mean that you've reached a destination. There's no destination. You have to keep engaging with that work.
Yeah, so true. So I'm going to move us to our last part of our discussion, which is sort of applying sort of what we're learning to our practice. And, if you could think about, if you're because we have a lot of solos and people in small firms, if a person who is in that kind of practice is thinking like, oh yeah, maybe I will try a holistic model. Are there certain things that you might think about to evaluate would it work for your practice? So if you're a person who's practicing in just one legal area, does it make sense to do that, or in a particular area? Or, I think you're all holistic model champions, so you'll probably say any practice area is suited for a holistic model. But I'm wondering if you could give any thoughts on this question.
So I actually think, besides the sort of like kind of practice model that you have, it also really depends on you as a person. For example, I actually like a challenge, and I like jumping in to the unknown and figuring out if I can make it work. But maybe you are somebody who kind of likes that now that you've figured out how your case is supposed to process, you like being able to follow a template and have something consistent that you can follow through on. The holistic model may feel a little more intimidating. It may cause a lot more anxiety. And so I don't know if it actually is for every single person, but at least recognizing that your client may have multiple needs, and so thinking about like other resources that you can connect them to. I think regardless of what the kind of model, whether you're a solo practitioner or part of a large firm or legal aid, I think all of us can engage in that practice.
That makes sense. John, or Catherine, or Josh?
I think I've already said I'm pretty sold on this model. So, I think Rudy's right. Not everybody may feel comfortable doing this, but I think every practice area could employ a holistic model and have it work really well and have clients be probably more satisfied with their experience. And again, thinking from the medical legal partnership angle, I'm sure there are medical providers in your community that would welcome even just consulting or talking to you about the kinds of things that they see and, how your work flows, because we are so siloed and we speak different languages, and so it takes a while to break down those barriers and also to build up the relationship. And of course, medical providers sometimes fear, liability, having a lawyer in the clinic talking to patients, and so really trying to address that maybe you just want to take on landlord-tenant cases involving mold for kids with asthma, not anything to do with any kind of medical malpractice. So just thinking through, what area of your practice could fit in to the work that a medical provider is doing in the community, and starting that conversation.
Right. Do you have anything to add, Josh?
I would just say, I'm similarly a big believer in this model, so I think it's something that can work for every practice area, at least in the extent of thinking about your client as a whole person. That fits every practice area.
Yeah, so true. Okay, so now we're going to move on to questions that we might have from some participants. I'm going to ask our folks here.
Can you repeat the first question while we solve the math problem?
Oh, okay. So I just...
And you can repeat what I say.
Okay.
Can the panelists please comment on possible ways to adopt or incorporate a holistic approach when it is representation is temporarily limited, such as a one-day clinic?
Oh, so can you comment on how you might use a holistic model when your representation is limited to a one-day clinic?
So we actually have workshops and clinics in the community with survivor groups, and I think one thing you can do in a clinic model is, first of all, acknowledge that the survivor or the client is dealing with multiple issues, and it doesn't mean that you have to be able to provide actual legal information on every single area, because that is really hard to do on the fly. But especially if your clinic is being set up through your local bar associations, obviously there are a lot of resources that they have, and sometimes we have a tendency to hold on to the resources and want to just share verbally, but creating more of a packet that people can walk away with so that they have something more that they can follow through on, I think is one way of kind of trying to approach the holistic model with advice and support and volunteering that you're doing in a clinic.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the resources that we've plugged already are really important to be able to give out, particularly things like Washington Law Help, just being able to point clients in a good direction, and also understanding from the beginning that we have half an hour together. I understand you have many issues, and then trying to triage and prioritize them.
I would just say, finally, there's so many clinics, and some of the clinics that I volunteered for have like a huge binder that you can go and consult and then pull information out. And so if the clinic that you're volunteering at doesn't have something like that, maybe having that clinic talk to another clinic, because there's lots of those binders and materials pulled together for those one-day experiences. And that seems like an easy thing to build community around.
Okay, thanks. Is there another question?
We had a lot of really good questions, so we batched them into topic areas. One area was can be summarized as, how do you build trusting and accountable relationships with your clients?
Josh, do you want to start?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's, as we've mentioned before, is really meeting your client where they are. If your client needs some special accommodations just to feel comfortable in the office, meet them where they're at. As going back to like the race equity lens, I had a client recently who was Muslim and was visiting during Ramadan. Being cognizant of what is this person going through right now. I think, recognizing that, meeting them where they are, and being genuinely present. If it takes the, I don't know if you've heard this mindfulness practice of basically before you go into a meeting, sort of pausing, taking a deep breath, and really centering yourself before you go in with a client. I think it just makes all the difference because you're able to be really present and help break that assumption that we're all just busy lawyers running around with no concern except for our own. So I think presence is really important.
Catherine, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, one of the tools that we use is this questionnaire, which is great to help trigger people to think about the issues that they've had. But I actually think it's really important to also set it aside and really listen to what clients have to say and tell their story in their own words, in their own way. And if you can, and of course you have to sometimes tactfully interrupt some clients, and other clients, you really have to give them space to talk. And so, you're always kind of navigating and reading the situation. But no matter what, I always try and ask clients at the end of the meeting, is there anything else that you wanted to tell me today? We talked about a lot of things. I may have gone through a questionnaire or whatever, but is there anything that we didn't cover that you think I need to know? And I am always amazed at what comes out in an answer to that question. And so just really, giving yourself space to give the client the last word.
I'll just add that, I am very honest with my clients when I don't know something, and I think just that for a lot of clients can be refreshing, and I think that allows them to also realize that I'm not going to just tell them, provide them answers because I think that they want to hear that, and I think that also can create more of a trusting relationship.
I just wanted to add also, I think being able to acknowledge that the system's messed up. If that's where your client's feeling, acknowledge that the system's messed up, that this is complicated, that I don't know everything. I think that humility and humbleness that you can bring to your client is really helpful.
Yeah. And I think I would also add, just thinking about when I've interviewed clients, is to acknowledge how much it takes for them to tell their story. And they probably may have told their story multiple times and how difficult that might be. So I think it's just being human with each other. Yeah. We have just a minute left, so I'm not sure. Do we have time for one more question? Okay.
Let's see. We've had quite a few questions about malpractice issues and how you might avoid those or be aware of them when using the holistic model.
I think part of the malpractice issue, no matter what, attorney-client privilege applies, and paying attention to your basic responsibilities as an attorney. I do think it's also going back and recognizing that you will not know every practice area and acknowledging that. This is where it really is important to know resources so that you don't feel this pressure on yourself to be the one to have or try to feel like you have to provide the answer in every area, because I think that can lead to a lot of problems and complications. Over-promising can lead to a lot of problems and complications. So also being very, very clear in what capacity you have and where the client can go for maybe some of the other needs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, I think we probably need to close things up here. Sorry we aren't able to answer everyone's questions, but please feel free to follow up with the speakers or in your survey if you want more information or more of this. It would be helpful to know. And I just want to thank everyone who's participated today with all your great questions. And then, of course, our speakers today was sharing just your really inspiring approach to serving our client communities. So thank you.
Thanks, Diana.
Thank you.